Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's lecture. This week we're going to be talking about the classical period in the Western canon. It lasted from between 1750 to 1820. I do want to again remind us that these date ranges that we put out aren't necessarily like it's not like people woke up at 1750 and they just immediately started composing differently, or in 1821 everything stopped and they no longer composed music this way. No, these are trends, these are major patterns of ideas, and so there's overlap between, but we do start to see a new style of composition and a new kind of aesthetic that appears during the classical period. A quick review is that last week, or at least in our last lesson, we were looking at the Baroque period in European music, and this was between 1600 and 1750. Baroque music is characterized by kind of these long, extended, ornamented lines. It's very self indulgent. If you compare it to the architectural style, there's lots of details everywhere and flourishes all over the place. And so, kind of, I like again thinking about these extended ornamental lines. It's all about the decoration and the detail. The oratorio and the opera, and of course the fugue, were born during this time. And we have great composers like Gabrieli and Handel and Bach and others in the European scene who kind of came to the forefront and really, for modern audiences, characterized this time. We also see instruments evolving during this time and a lot more attention being paid to instruments. It wasn't just kind of localized folk tradition anymore. They were playing huge roles in large scale musical works. And that brings us to our topic today, which is the classical period. The classical period is much shorter than the size of the Baroque. It's not nearly as long, but its legacy is just as impactful and it's just as important. It's just kind of really jam packed into a short amount of time. So during the 18th century, many European thinkers became nostalgic for the ideas of the ancient world. We're thinking about Greece in particular. As is the trend, music lagged behind the adoption of classicism in art. But when we get to this time, we start to see these older ideas of balance and elegance and symmetry that contrast with what we saw in the Baroque, which was all about like extravagance. Now we're looking for elegance. We're looking for less decoration, but the same amount of substance. So we see an emphasis, as I said, on balance. There are shorter, more singable lines. So whereas in the Baroque you'd have these long da 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 da, these long lines that really went on and on. The classical period was much more singable. So these are tunes that you could hum to yourself. There was lots of question and answer phrasing, which kind of goes into that symmetry. One instrument group might state the beginning of a musical phrase, and then another in the orchestra would finish that phrase, and so it kind of counterbalances itself. There's the use of contrasting moods, which we'll see in some of the new forms that we get introduced with. There's a lot of this kind of melody plus accompaniment with some counterpoint, but it's a lot of kind of there's a melody, and then there's everyone supporting that melody. I mentioned there's going to be some new forms, and then of course we continue to have new technologies and new instruments that are being introduced and that are evolving through this time. I like introducing some world events to give you some context for like what was happening. These particular ones, although they do cover things across the world, I think for our purposes it might be helpful in framing them in the context of things that were happening in America. We see the Industrial Revolution during this time. Beethoven is born during this time. We'll talk later more about his relationship to the classical period. But the American Revolution happened, Declaration of Independence, the Constitution happens, the Louisiana Purchase happens during this time. We have great thinkers like Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln who were born during this time. And so you can kind of put yourself into the shoes of a person who was living during the classical period. This is what we think of as kind of the birth of the nation, and kind of the beginnings of our democracy. So this brings us to our first new form. We're going to talk about sonata form. Sonata form is most frequently used in the first movement of symphonies, which is another thing that we're going to be talking about later. It's usually used in the opening section, which is this fast section. But sonata, the idea can be kind of a little confusing. The word sonata gets used a lot. The term comes from the Italian sonore, which just means to sound, and so there's lots of different kinds of music that have been called sonatas. But when we think about a sonata form, so a way of shaping a single piece of music, it usually comes in this shape, with three you have to have sections, and then there's two others, one at the beginning and then one at the end, that different composers add for different reasons. We often have an optional introduction, which kind of leads us in to an A section, which is the exposition. Later we have a development, where the composer tries to develop some of the initial ideas. They'll maybe go to a contrasting key or use some like sequenced compositional techniques to extend on the idea of the music that was introduced at the beginning. We have a recapitulation where we return to the original ideas, and then sometimes there's some closing material at the end. Also, it's worth noting that during the A sections, we usually jump back and forth between whatever the tonic or the home key is, and then a dominant or contrasting key for a moment before returning back. So again, it's all very structured, it's all very harmonic, there's nothing that sticks out, but with the development section and with the jumping to the other keys and the exposition and the recapitulation, there is enough contrast to keep the listener interested. But sonata form is something worth noting. The other way that we hear sonata used during this time are usually kind of solo pieces for piano, or for piano accompanied by violin, or for violin accompanied by piano, or for other instruments accompanied by the piano. But when we talk about sonata form, this is what we're talking about, this kind of ABA with an optional introduction and a coda. Here's some great examples from Mozart and Haydn that you can listen to, two of the huge figures from this time in the classical era. Next up, I found these pictures that someone used cookies to describe the different forms, and so I really like this one. This describes the theme and variation form. The theme and variation is a very common structure during the classical period, and it's also one that still gets used a lot in modern classical music, or even in other types of kind of art music still to this day. Basically, the composer will introduce a tune, and then they, over the course of several variations, will play the tune again but alter it in some way. So maybe they'll change the key, they'll put it from a major key into a minor key, maybe they will change the time signature, so instead of being in 4, now it's in 3, or a different time signature. Maybe they'll invert the melody so it descends rather than ascends, or they'll put it into other sorts of tonalities or whatnot. There's all sorts of different changes that people can do, and it's usually a really fun kind of compositional activity for the composer to kind of test themselves, like how many different lenses can I look at this musical idea through, and then usually at the end they'll return to the original form. So many great composers over the ages have written a theme and variations. Also, a lot of composers like to pay homage to someone that they admire by taking a tune that someone that they're very fond of composed, and they will do their own variations on that tune, like we see with like a Ralph Vaughan Williams or someone like that. Speaking of Mozart earlier, here's the famous Twinkle Twinkle Little Star variations. So there, I think, are 12 different variations here. He wrote these when he was around 25 years old, although the story is that he wrote the original tune much earlier than that, but these variations came out around the age of 25. And so this is a great, again, video I encourage you to watch, and as you are watching it, see if you can kind of identify each different variation and notice how he's changing things. Next up, we have rondo form. So again, we got the cookie picture, which I think helps to describe this. Rondo form rondo was kind of a very popular technique of the time. People really like this kind of you introduce a musical idea, go to something else, and then you come back to the original one, and they feel like, oh, I recognize that, and then you go to something else again, and then you come back to the original one, and each time it comes back to the A section, it's this feeling of familiarity. It's this feeling of really enjoying returning to something that you know and seeing how it contrasts with these other types. Rondo music or rondo form often is an A B A C A. Like you can see again, we return to the A each time, but sometimes the B section will come back again. Sometimes the C section will come back, but the main emphasis is that it always returns to the main theme. We see it used a lot in symphonies, sonatas, concertos, string quartets. Again, these are just forms. These are just structures. I like, again, thinking about forms the same way that I think about rhyme scheme in poetry is the way I feel that it's helpful to think about form. So that's rondo form. A rondo form, the main idea is that you're always returning to the A section. It grounds the listener. And now we arrive at the triumphant symphony. So symphonies for composers throughout time have been these really Herculean undertakings. To write a symphony is this huge endeavor. It involves tons of musicians, a full orchestra, sometimes even a choir. It's a really large-scale work, and it's one of the kind of biggest projects that a composer can undertake. So often thought of as a keystone of European classical music, the symphony is an instrumental piece, and it's usually in 4 movements. These 4 movements are often broken down as I've listed them here. The first movement is fast, sometimes in sonata form. The second movement is slow, and again, I want to point out this element of contrast here, this element of balance that is indicative of the classical period, this contrast between fast and slow. The third movement is a dance, and that's usually a minuet. Minuets were this form of dance that was super popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. They're in triple meter, and the general public really liked these, and so composers kind of include these. And then finally, we finish off with, again, another fast movement at the end to send everybody out on a high, on a really triumphant note. There are exceptions to this rule. For example, Beethoven's Symphony No. 6, which has 5 movements. And I've included here a recording of Symphony No. 9, which kind of broke the mold from having just instruments to also adding in voices to the final movement, which was a really huge development. I've kind of been pointing it out as we've gone along, but I hope that as we're looking at these different forms, so at the rondo form, or if we're looking at the theme and variations, or the sonata form, that I hope that you can note that there's a huge emphasis put on symmetry. Whenever I think of the classical period, because remember, they were looking back to antiquity, they were looking back to societies like Greece, and I like to think of these kind of Grecian columns, the different types, because they're all so symmetrical. There's so much order when you're looking at them. Everything can be easily divided in half. And I think there again is this symmetry when you're looking at the forms of the music that we hear during the classical period. So as we reflect on the forms, I hope that kind of maybe this idea of symmetry, and especially the symmetry as viewed through these columns or through the ideas, some of the larger academic principles that come out of the Enlightenment, or out of kind of this classical philosophy, can be helpful when thinking about this symmetry that we find here. I mentioned some instrumental evolution, so of course instruments continue to evolve, and as our instruments evolved, whether they are the instruments in the violin family or the woodwinds, we start to see all sorts of new ensembles that are put together. So we see string quartets and wind quartets and piano trios, and these new ensembles are responsible for tons of new music that composers begin to write. So we see Schubert, or some people say Schubert. We see Rossetti, Haydn, Mozart. Everyone is writing for these new ensembles. A string quartet consists of 4 string players. We have 2 violins, a viola, and a cello. String quartets are beloved for their perfect blending. Obviously, they are all from the same family. They're all played in a very similar fashion, and they all draw their ancestry back to the same instrument. So we're talking about like the viol da gambas and whatnot from the preceding eras. Wind quintets, as the name suggests, have 5 instruments. These are swapped out from time to time, but most common are the flute, the oboe, clarinet, French horn, bassoon. And unlike the string quartets, the instruments are combined for their unique timbres and the unique attributes that they bring to the group. So whereas violins, violas, and cellos, they have this amazing blend, and they're very similar in their timbre, we have a very different blending when it comes to wind quintets. And so you see composers playing around a lot more with the textures that are in the wind quintets. So that's kind of a significant element of when someone's thinking about writing for them. The piano trio is an ensemble comprised of a piano and 2 other instruments, but the most common grouping is a piano, a violin, and a cello. And so I've put some videos here where you can listen to a piano trio, a string quartet, and a wind quintet, some of the most famous from this period of music. We can't speak about the piano trio without speaking about the evolution of the piano. So around the 1700s, Bartholomew Cristofori created the new keyboard instrument, which changed the world. Everything changed after this moment, and he called it the pianoforte. And it set itself apart from some of the earlier piano or keyboard instruments that had come before. So in the years preceding the classical period, we have the clavichord, we have a harpsichord. There are various other kind of evolutions on the idea of the keyboard instrument, the spinet. But the thing that set the pianoforte apart was that, as its name suggests, it had the ability to play both loudly and softly. So with all of the keyboard instruments that had come before, when you would press the key, you would get one volume. And it didn't matter if you pressed the key very hard or if you pressed the key very soft. There was no dynamic difference. So no matter how hard you pressed it, your note was going to be the same volume. And this all changed with the pianoforte because of the way that it was built. It had these hammers that would strike the strings when you would play it. And so if you hit the key hard, it would strike the string very hard, and it would make a loud sound. And if you hit it soft, it would strike the string softly. So whereas before, the only way that a composer could get dynamic contrast on a piece of music on a keyboard instrument was if you wanted it louder, you added more notes, and if you wanted it softer, you had the player play fewer notes. But now you could have dynamic contrast in a single key, and so there was just this kind of what was just revolutionary at the time, and it gave composers so many more tools when writing for a keyboard instrument. In the beginning, the pianoforte had a modest 4-octave range, but before its obsolescence, there were instruments that were 6.5 keys, all the way up to the 88 keys that is common today with our grand pianos. This is a great video from a great channel on YouTube called The Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment. They are kind of these classical instrument aficionados, and they introduce you to all sorts of obsolete instruments or instruments that we don't use anymore that can kind of give you an appreciation. And so this is a kind of, will introduce you to what type of instrument we can imagine that Mozart was most likely working on. And so you can get a feel for, based on the instrument he had access to, what sort of ideas would have been obvious or not obvious to him, based on the limitations of the instrument in front of him. And like I mentioned, this video is about Mozart's piano, so of course we have to talk about one of the most notable figures from this period, which is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He was born in Salzburg, Austria, and he was a child prodigy. From his very earliest ages, when he was first accessing instruments, his father noticed that he had this amazing ability to play and to compose music. During his short life, he composed over 600 works and mastered all of the styles of the time, including the sonata, the symphony, and opera. For all of his notoriety, though, during his lifetime, Mozart suffered from personal failings, although he was considered one of the most notable composers of the time, and still to this day, he died a pauper, buried in a linen sack, and laid to rest in a communal grave. He is remembered today, though, for his huge output, for some of his masterful writing and his catalog and just the diversity of all the things he wrote. And is remembered today as one of the musical geniuses of the European tradition. From an early age, he and his sister were kind of taken around by his father to visit royalty throughout Europe. And he was kind of like a carnival attraction. His father would bring him in, and it was amazing to see this small child who couldn't even reach the floor while sitting on the piano bench play amazing pieces of music, and he would play them blindfolded, or they would give him music he had never seen, and he would just play it, incredibly. His humor can be seen not just in his music. There's certain kind of musical jokes that he plays in some of his music if you pay very close attention, but also in his writing. He was a very funny and possibly even inappropriate guy at times. If you look at some of his letters between he and his sister or his cousins, there's a lot of humor, particularly potty humor, to be found in those. Oh, and of course, we cannot move through the classical period without talking about Beethoven. He was a huge, interesting figure, and I think one of the reasons that Beethoven is so interesting is because he straddled the classical period and the Romantic period. He's kind of like right in the center of the two, and you can see this in his compositional output and his style, but it's my feeling that Beethoven is best discussed during the Romantic period, which will be our next lecture, because I think his contributions and like the most notable of his works are mostly associated with that time, so with the Romantic period. So we will discuss the great Beethoven in our next lecture when we go over the Romantic period. I think he best fits there, although it is worth noting, as I said, that he straddles these two, and his earlier output can be seen through a more classical lens. There's a list of key terms. You can look over those for yourself and some listening examples. As always, I really appreciate you guys watching these lectures, and I hope that they help you out. I hope you get something from them. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out through email. I always try to get back to you as soon as possible. And I hope you all have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions at all.